A boy hears God's voice warning of imminent danger. The voice says, "The community hall will collapse." Alone in his conviction, armed with nothing but his chilling premonition, he struggles to sound the alarm. But with every ticking second towards the town's biggest gathering, skepticism grows. Can he convince them before it's too late? What will it take for them to believe the impossible? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. In the heart of Vermont's rolling hills, Maplewood painted a perfect autumn picture. Red and gold maple leaves danced in the crisp morning breeze, carpeting the sidewalks of Main Street. White picket fences lined well-kept yards, and smoke curled from brick chimneys into the clear blue sky. Tommy Hawkins walked slowly down Cedar Lane, his sneakers crunching through fallen leaves. At 10 years old, he knew every crack in the sidewalk, every mailbox, and every friendly face that passed by. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he kept his eyes down, hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. The iron gates of Maplewood Cemetery creaked as Tommy pushed them open. The familiar path to his mother's grave was worn from his daily visits. Fresh flowers, probably from Mrs. Peterson next door, lay against the smooth granite headstone. Tommy sat cross-legged on the grass, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. "Hi, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. Old Mr. Wilson, tending to his wife's grave nearby, gave Tommy a sad smile and a little wave. "Morning, son," he called softly. Tommy managed a small nod but didn't speak. He'd gotten used to the way people looked at him now, that mixture of sympathy and awkwardness in their eyes. Mrs. Baker from the grocery store hurried past, her arms full of paper bags. "Tommy, honey, tell your father I put aside those apples he likes," she said, her voice too bright, too cheerful. Tommy nodded again, knowing she meant well but wishing people wouldn't try so hard. Later, Tommy made his way to the community hall, a grand old building with weathered red bricks and tall white columns. The wooden steps creaked under his feet, just like they always had. Inside, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, creating colorful patterns on the worn wooden floor. The memories hit him as soon as he stepped inside. His mother's laugh echoed in his mind, the way she'd twirl him around during last year's harvest dance, her green dress spinning. How she'd hold his hand during town meetings, letting him share her chocolate chip cookies while the adults talked about boring things. He could still see her helping to hang Christmas decorations, standing on a ladder, her dark hair falling from its ponytail as she stretched to reach the highest spots. "Careful, Mom," he'd called, and she'd look down at him with that smile that made everything okay. Tommy made his way to the back of the hall, settling into one of the old wooden chairs. Above him, massive timber beams crossed the ceiling, their dark wood holding decades of town history. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting blues and greens across his face. Here, surrounded by memories of his mother, the ache in his chest felt different. Not lighter exactly, but somehow more bearable. He traced his fingers along the carved initials in the chair arm, some so old they'd almost worn away. The familiar smells of wood polish and old hymnals filled his nose. In this quiet moment, with colored light dancing around him and the weight of memories pressing close, Tommy felt nearest to his mother since she'd gone. After talking to his mother, he headed to the community hall. The emptiness of the community hall amplified every sound Tommy made. His footsteps echoed off the high ceiling as he wandered around, running his hand along the smooth wooden chairs. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows, making patterns that reminded him of his mother's quilts. Drawn to the stage where he'd once performed in the school play, Tommy climbed the creaky steps. The floorboards groaned under his feet as he walked across the worn wooden platform. He remembered his mother sitting in the front row, beaming with pride as he delivered his lines as the third shepherd in the Christmas pageant. That's when he heard it. "The beams will fall." The voice was crystal clear, as if someone stood right next to him. Tommy spun around, his heart jumping into his throat. The hall was empty, completely empty. "The old timber cannot hold. The hall will collapse." Tommy's hands began to shake. The voice wasn't scary exactly. It was calm and firm, like a teacher giving important instructions, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" he called out, his own voice bouncing back at him from the walls. No answer came. Tommy sat down hard on the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side. His mind raced. Was he imagining things? He'd heard about people who were so sad they started hearing voices. But this felt different. This voice had been so real, so certain. He looked up at the massive wooden beams crossing the ceiling. They'd always been there, solid and strong, holding up the roof for as long as anyone could remember. But now, studying them more carefully, he noticed how dark and weathered they looked. Were those cracks he saw in the wood? The voice's words kept repeating in his head. The hall will collapse. Tommy's stomach twisted into knots. What if it was real? What if something terrible was going to happen? The community hall was always full of people. Town meetings, church gatherings, school plays. If the roof fell in... Tommy jumped off the stage, his sneakers hitting the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the empty space. He had to tell someone. His dad would know what to do. His dad always knew what to do. Racing down the center aisle, Tommy's footsteps thundered in the quiet hall. He burst through the heavy wooden doors and practically flew down the front steps. His legs carried him as fast as they could go, heading for home where his father would be finishing up his workday. The voice had been so clear, so sure. Tommy knew people might not believe him. They already treated him differently since his mom died. But he had to try. He had to make them understand. Tommy ran faster, his breath coming in quick gasps, determined to reach his father and share what he'd heard before it was too late. Tommy burst through the front door, nearly tripping over his own feet. He found his father in the living room, typing away on his laptop, probably working on his latest article for the local paper. Dad, something happened at the community hall." Tommy's words tumbled out between gasps for air. Richard Hawkins looked up from his work, concern crossing his face. "Whoa, slow down, buddy, take a breath. What's going on?" Tommy dropped onto the couch, his chest still heaving. "I was at the hall on the stage and I heard a voice. It said the beams are going to fall, that the whole hall's going to collapse." His father's expression shifted from concern to something else. That familiar look adults got when they thought he was being silly. A voice? Was someone else there with you? "No, that's just it. I was alone." "But Dad, it was so clear, like someone was standing right next to me." Tommy leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "You have to believe me." Richard closed his laptop and moved to sit beside his son. "Tommy, I know things have been hard since Mom." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes when we're upset or lonely, our minds can play tricks on us." "This wasn't my imagination," Tommy insisted, his voice cracking. "It was real." "How about we talk about this over dinner?" Richard suggested, squeezing Tommy's shoulder. "I'll make your favorite mac and cheese." During dinner, Tommy barely touched his food, too busy trying to convince his father about what he'd heard. Finally, Richard put down his fork and sighed. "Okay, tell you what. I'll ask around tomorrow. See if anyone's noticed any problems with the building. Would that make you feel better?" Tommy nodded, though he could tell his father was just humoring him. The next morning, Richard stopped by Thompson's General Store. Mrs. Agnes Linden was there, arranging a display of local maple syrup. A few other regulars lounged near the coffee counter. "Morning, Richard," Mrs. Linden called out warmly. "How's our Tommy doing?" Richard ran a hand through his hair. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you all about something. Tommy had quite an experience at the community hall yesterday. He said he heard a voice warning him about the building collapsing." The store went quiet. Bill Thompson paused while restocking shelves. "A voice? Was someone there with him?" "He says he was alone," Richard explained. "I know it sounds strange." "Poor dear," Mrs. Linden said softly. "He's been through so much this past year." "Kid's got quite an imagination," Bill commented, shaking his head. "Maybe he needs to talk to someone?" suggested Sarah Miller from behind the coffee counter. "My sister's boy saw a counselor after their divorce. really helped him adjust. Mrs. Linden watched the others discuss Tommy's mental state, noting how their concern focused on his grief rather than his warning. She saw the worry in Richard's eyes, a father trying his best to help his son through a difficult time. "You know," she spoke up, her voice cutting through the chatter, "maybe we should take a look at those old beams anyway. When was the last time anyone actually inspected them?" Mrs. Linden stood at Joe Baxter's front door, her weathered hands clasped together. "Joe, I know it's asking a lot, but that boy is truly worried. Couldn't you just take a look?" Joe, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, sighed and smiled. "For you, Agnes, I'll do it. Tommy's been through enough already." The next morning, Tommy waited anxiously outside the community hall as Joe pulled up in his pickup truck, carrying his toolbox and wearing a hard hat. Mrs. Linden placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Now don't you worry," she said softly. "Joe's the best engineer in 3 counties." Inside the hall, Joe walked slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He tapped walls, checked support beams, and made notes on his clipboard. Tommy followed close behind, pointing to areas where he thought the voice had come from. "The voice was right here, Mr. Baxter," Tommy insisted, pointing to a corner near the stage. "It was so clear." Joe knelt down, examining the floor joints and foundation. He pulled out a measuring tape and checked the levelness of the floor. Mrs. Linden watched from nearby, her eyes moving between Tommy's hopeful face and Joe's methodical work. After 2 hours of thorough inspection, Joe stood up, wiping his brow. "Well, I've checked everything I can think of," he said, his voice kind but firm. "There are some minor issues, a bit of water damage in the southeast corner, and we could use some new support brackets on a few beams, but nothing that suggests any danger of collapse." Tommy's face fell. But I heard it." The voice said. "Tommy," Joe interrupted gently, "this building's been standing for over 100 years. It's got good bones, son. Those minor repairs can wait until spring." Mrs. Linden watched as Tommy's shoulders slumped. The boy's eyes grew distant, that same lost look she'd seen at his mother's funeral returning to his face. "Thank you for checking, Joe," Mrs. Linden said, squeezing Tommy's shoulder. "We appreciate your thoroughness." Tommy turned without a word and walked toward the exit. Mrs. Linden watched him push through the heavy wooden doors into the late afternoon sun. Her heart ached as she saw him shuffle down the street, his head down and hands stuffed in his pockets. Joe came to stand beside her. "Agnes, that boy needs help dealing with his grief, not ghost stories." Mrs. Linden nodded slowly, but something in her chest felt tight as she watched Tommy's small figure growing smaller in the distance. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, and she found herself caught between the rational world of Joe's expertise and the desperate certainty she'd seen in Tommy's eyes. "Maybe you're right, Joe," she said quietly, though her eyes never left Tommy's retreating form. "Maybe you're right." The autumn breeze rustled through Maplewood's maple trees as Tommy walked down Main Street. Outside Miller's coffee shop, Mrs. Peterson and her friend huddled over steaming cups, their voices carrying on the wind. "Poor thing losing his mother like that," Mrs. Peterson whispered, not noticing Tommy approaching. "No wonder he's having these episodes." Tommy slowed his pace, his shoulders tensing as he passed by. "Someone should talk to his father about getting him some help," her friend replied. "Professional help, you know." Inside Green's grocery, Tommy lingered by the candy display, pretending to look at chocolate bars while Mr. Green talked with customers near the register. "First ghosts, now voices?" Mr. Green shook his head. "That Hawkins boy needs guidance, not people entertaining these fantasies." At the post office, Tommy waited in line as Mrs. Martinez sorted mail behind the counter. 2 elderly men stood ahead of him, discussing the community hall. "Joe Baxter himself checked it out," one said. "Nothing wrong with that building that can't wait till spring." "It's that Tommy boy stirring up trouble," the other replied. "Grief does strange things to people." Outside on the playground, Tommy spotted Jake and some other kids from his class. He walked over, hoping maybe they'd understand. "Hey guys," Tommy said, shuffling his feet. "Did you hear about the community hall?" Jake rolled his eyes. "You mean your ghost story?" Come on, Tommy. Nobody believes in that stuff. The other kids snickered. Maybe it was your mom's ghost, one boy said, then immediately looked sorry he'd said it. Tommy's face burned as he turned away, their awkward laughter following him. Near the town square, Mrs. Linden was leaving the pharmacy when she overheard Sarah Wilson talking to the pharmacist. I heard he's been having hallucinations, Sarah said. My sister's a therapist in Burlington. I could give Richard her number. Might be for the best, the pharmacist agreed. Boy's been through trauma, needs professional help, not the town playing along with his delusions. Mrs. Linden's heart sank as she watched Tommy trudging toward the park across the street. She saw him sit heavily on a bench, his small frame looking particularly lonely against the backdrop of bustling town life. People walked past, going about their daily routines. A mother pushed a stroller. A dog walker juggled 3 leashes. 2 teenagers shared earbuds and laughed at something on a phone. Tommy sat still, watching it all pass by, separate from the flow of normal life around him. His fingers traced the wooden slats of the bench, and Mrs. Linden could see, even from a distance, how his isolation weighed on his young shoulders. The same bench where he used to sit with his mother and eat ice cream cones now seemed to emphasize the empty space beside him. Mrs. Linden watched Tommy for a few more moments before making her way across the street. As she approached, her sensible shoes clicked against the sidewalk, and Tommy looked up with tired eyes. Tommy, dear, she said warmly, I just pulled a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies from the oven. Would you like to come over for milk and cookies? Tommy hesitated, then nodded slowly. The walk to Mrs. Linden's cozy yellow house was quiet, but comfortable. Her garden, full of late-blooming flowers, seemed to welcome them home. Inside, the smell of cookies filled the air. Tommy sat at her kitchen table, the same one where he'd spent many afternoons with his mother during their weekly visits. Mrs. Linden placed a plate of cookies and a cold glass of milk in front of him. Now then, she said, settling into the chair across from him with her own cookie, why don't you tell me exactly what you heard in the community hall? Tommy took a small bite of cookie, letting the chocolate melt on his tongue. The voice was so clear, Mrs. Linden, like someone standing right next to me. His fingers traced the rim of his glass. It said the hall was going to collapse. I know everyone thinks I'm making it up, but I'm not. Mrs. Linden reached across the table and patted his hand. I believe you heard something, Tommy, and I think we should take it seriously. Tommy's eyes widened. You do? Yes, I do. She stood up and walked to the phone mounted on her kitchen wall. In fact, I'm going to call Joe Baxter right now. We'll ask him to do another inspection, more thorough this time. And she dialed the number, and Tommy watched as she spoke into the receiver. Joe? It's Agnes Linden. Yes, about the community hall. I know you've already looked, but could you do me a favor and check again? More thoroughly this time. Yes, it would mean a lot to me. Tomorrow morning, that would be wonderful. When she hung up, Tommy was sitting straighter in his chair, a spark of hope in his eyes. Joe will be there tomorrow morning at 9, she said, returning to her seat. We'll go together, and he'll check everything again. Every beam, every foundation stone. Really? Tommy asked, reaching for another cookie with slightly trembling fingers. Mrs. Linden smiled warmly. Really? Sometimes it takes more than one look to see things clearly, and even if we don't find anything wrong, at least we'll know we tried our very best. Tommy finished his milk and cookies, the weight on his shoulders seeming a little lighter. As he stood to leave, Mrs. Linden wrapped him in a quick hug. Thank you, he whispered. We'll figure this out together, she assured him. See you tomorrow morning. Tommy stepped out onto Mrs. Linden's porch, the afternoon sun warming his face. For the first time since hearing the voice, he felt a small bubble of hope in his chest. Someone was finally listening. The next morning, Joe Baxter pulled up in his pickup truck in front of the community hall. His toolbox rattled as he climbed out, greeting Mrs. Linden and Tommy with a friendly wave. Good morning, Agnes, Tommy. He adjusted his hard hat and grabbed his flashlight. Let's take a good look at this old place, shall we? Inside, Joe's boots echoed on the wooden floor as he began his inspection. He tapped beams with his hammer, shined his flashlight into corners, and made notes on his clipboard. "See here, Tommy?" Joe pointed his flashlight at a beam. "This is old-growth timber. They don't make them like this anymore. Solid as a rock." Tommy shuffled closer, his face serious. "But what about up there?" He pointed to a dark corner near the ceiling. "In my dream, I saw cracks spreading from that spot." Joe set up his ladder and climbed up for a closer look. "There are some hairline cracks here," he admitted, running his fingers along the wall. "But that's normal settling in a building this age, nothing structural." Mrs. Linden watched as Tommy's shoulders slumped. The boy moved to another section of the hall near the stage. "The voice was strongest here," he said quietly. It felt like the whole place was groaning. Joe followed, getting down on his knees to examine the floorboards. "There's a bit of water damage from an old leak," he explained, pointing to a darkened section of wood. "But it's surface level, son. The supporting joists underneath are still solid." For the next hour, Joe methodically checked every concern Tommy raised. He measured crack widths, tested load-bearing walls, and examined the foundation through the basement access. "Well," Joe said finally, wiping his hands on his jeans, "I've looked at everything twice now. Yes, there are some minor issues that's expected in a building this old, but I stake my professional reputation on this. There's no danger of collapse." Mrs. Linden squeezed Tommy's shoulder. "That's good news, isn't it?" But Tommy shook his head, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "The voice was so clear," he whispered. "It felt so real." Joe knelt down to Tommy's level. "Look, son, I know you're worried, but I've been doing this for 30 years. These old buildings, they make all sorts of noises, settling, expanding, contracting with the weather. But this hall, it's got another 100 years in it, easy." Tommy's face fell and he stepped away from both adults. Mrs. Linden could see the familiar look of isolation creeping back into his eyes, as once again, his warnings were dismissed. "Thank you for being so thorough, Joe," Mrs. Linden said, but her eyes were on Tommy, who had retreated to stand alone by the stained glass windows. That night, Tommy tossed and turned in his bed. Sleep wouldn't come, not with the voice echoing in his mind clear as day. The hall will fall. He kicked off his covers and sat up, switching on his bedside lamp. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his sketchbook and pencils from the drawer. The blank page stared back at him until he began to draw, letting his memories of the dream guide his hand. The community hall's familiar outline took shape. First the steep roof, then the weathered walls, and finally the stained glass windows his mother had loved so much. But tonight, Tommy focused on the details that haunted him. His pencil moved frantically across the paper, shading in the dark corner where he'd seen the cracks spreading like spider webs. He sketched the stage area where the voice had been strongest, adding detailed notes about the groaning sounds he'd heard. Page after page filled with drawings, close-ups of support beams, the basement foundation, and the roof structure. Tommy drew until his hand cramped, then started again. The stack of sketches grew beside him as the night wore on. When morning came, Tommy hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red-rimmed as he gathered his sketches into his backpack. At breakfast, he barely touched his cereal, his mind already racing ahead to his plan. The library was quiet when Tommy arrived, just a few elderly readers scattered among the tables. He made his way to the local history section, pulling out heavy books about Maplewood's buildings. His sketches spread across the wooden table as he searched through yellowed pages and old photographs. "Can I help you find something?" the librarian whispered, adjusting her glasses as she peered at his work. "I'm looking for information about old buildings in town," Tommy replied softly. "Especially ones that had problems or collapsed." The librarian's eyebrows rose slightly, but she helped him locate more books before moving on to other tasks. Tommy buried himself in research, making notes about foundation issues and structural failures in other historic buildings. Hours passed. The lunch his father had packed sat forgotten in his backpack. Tommy's classmates might be playing baseball in the park or riding their bikes, but he couldn't think about that now. This was more important. He had to find proof, had to make them understand before it was too late. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the library windows, Tommy sat surrounded by stacks of books and papers. His latest sketch showed the community hall from every angle, with detailed annotations about his concerns. But despite all his work, he still had no concrete evidence to make the adults take him seriously. He stared at his drawings, feeling the weight of his responsibility pressed down on him. The voice had chosen him to hear the warning. So why couldn't he find a way to make anyone believe him? Frustration and helplessness washed over him as he looked at the spread of papers before him. Hours of work that might still not be enough to prevent what he knew was coming. Yet again at night, the shadows in Tommy's room seemed to dance across the walls as he lay in bed, his mind refusing to settle. The old maple tree outside his window cast moving shapes that made his imagination run wild. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind made him think of the community hall and what might happen if no one listened to his warnings. As exhaustion finally took hold, Tommy drifted into an uneasy sleep. In his dream, the community hall was filled with familiar faces. The annual Harvest Festival was in full swing. Cheerful decorations hung from the ceiling, and the smell of apple pie and cinnamon filled the air. Children ran between tables while adults chatted and laughed. Then he heard it, a low, ominous groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the building. Nobody else noticed at first, but Tommy watched in horror as hairline cracks appeared in the walls, spreading like lightning across the plaster. The wooden beams above began to splinter with sharp, crackling sounds. "Everyone, get out!" Tommy tried to shout, but his voice was lost in the festive noise. The cracks grew wider, chunks of ceiling beginning to rain down. People finally noticed, their laughter turning to screams. Parents grabbed their children, elderly folks stumbled toward the exits, and chaos erupted as the walls started to bow inward. Tommy jerked awake with a gasp, his pajamas damp with sweat. The dream had been so real. He could still hear the terrible sounds of breaking wood and crumbling stone, still see the terror on people's faces. His heart pounded against his ribs as he fumbled for the lamp switch. Sleep was impossible now. Tommy grabbed his sketchbook and pencils, his hands shaking slightly as he began to draw. The images from his dream were crystal clear in his mind, and he had to get them down on paper before they faded. He sketched the exact pattern of the cracks he'd seen, drawing arrows and making notes. Started here by the corner beam, and ceiling collapsed first, near the stage. Page after page filled with detailed drawings. Tommy sketched the buckling walls from different angles, adding notes about the sounds he'd heard and the order things had fallen. His normally neat handwriting grew messier as he rushed to capture every detail, his pencil moving frantically across the paper. The quiet of the night pressed in around him as he worked, broken only by the scratch of his pencil and his own quick breathing. His desk lamp cast a small circle of light, making the rest of his room seem darker by comparison. The stack of drawings grew, close-ups of support beams, detailed diagrams of crack patterns, the exact spot where the ceiling had first given way. Surrounded by his sketches in the pool of lamplight, Tommy felt the full weight of what he'd seen. Fear churned in his stomach as he looked at the evidence of disaster spread across his desk. These weren't just drawings anymore, they were warnings of what could happen if he couldn't convince anyone to take him seriously. The urgency of his mission pressed down on him like a physical weight, making his shoulders tense and his hands tremble as he reached for another blank page. In the morning, Tommy sat in his bedroom and carefully gathered his drawings. Each sketch told part of the story. The cracking walls, the buckling beams, the terrified faces from his dreams. He slipped them into his folder with trembling hands, hoping Ms. Clarkson would see what others had missed. During art class, while other students worked on their projects, Tommy approached Ms. Clarkson's desk. She looked up with kind eyes, adjusting her round glasses as he pulled out his folder. "Ms. Clarkson, would you look at these?" Tommy's voice was barely above a whisper. She took the drawings one by one, her expression changing from curiosity to genuine interest as she studied each detailed sketch. "Tommy, these are remarkable. The detail, the perspective. There's so much emotion in these." Tommy shifted from foot to foot. "They're about the community hall. I've been trying to tell people." His voice trailed off, unsure how to explain without sounding crazy. Ms. Clarkson spread the drawings across her desk, examining the precise lines and careful annotations. "You know, we have the town art exhibition coming up next week. These would make a powerful display." Really? Tommy's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this response. Art is one of the most powerful ways we can communicate our feelings and ideas, Ms. Clarkson explained, gathering the sketches carefully. Sometimes a picture can say things that words can't. Tommy felt a small flutter of hope in his chest. Do you think people will understand? I think they'll certainly stop and look, she said, pulling out a large portfolio case. May I keep these to prepare them for the exhibition? I'll make sure they're properly mounted and displayed. Tommy nodded slowly, watching as Ms. Clarkson gently placed each drawing into the portfolio. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt as she packed away the last sketch. This was different from trying to convince people with words, somehow both less scary and more frightening at the same time. I'll take good care of them, Ms. Clarkson promised, closing the portfolio case with care. Tommy stood there, his empty folder clutched to his chest, feeling strangely lighter yet nervous as he watched his drawings disappear into the case. For the first time, someone was taking his work seriously, even if they didn't yet understand its full meaning. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the way to make people see what he had been trying to tell them all along. The Maplewood Art Gallery buzzed with activity as volunteers hung paintings and arranged sculptures for the town's annual exhibition. Ms. Clarkson had given Tommy's drawings pride of place on the main wall, each one carefully mounted and labeled. The morning light streamed through the gallery's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Tommy arrived early with his father Richard, who gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze before heading off to chat with some neighbors. Tommy's stomach churned with nervous energy as he positioned himself near his display, partly hidden behind a large potted plant. The gallery doors opened at exactly 6 o'clock and people began streaming in. Tommy watched as they moved from piece to piece, sipping punch and nibbling on cookies from the refreshment table. When the first few visitors approached his drawings, he held his breath. My goodness, look at the detail in these, Mrs. Peterson, who ran the local bakery, said to her husband. I didn't know Tommy Hawkins could draw like this. Such dark subject matter, another visitor commented, leaning in closer to study the crumbling walls Tommy had depicted. The emotion really comes through. Ms. Clarkson circulated through the crowd, stopping occasionally to explain different pieces. When she reached Tommy's display, she spoke about the technical skill and artistic maturity shown in the works. Notice the attention to structural details, she pointed out to a small group. It's unusual to see such precise architectural rendering from someone so young. Tommy's ears burned as he listened to the comments. People praised his talent, but nobody seemed to understand what he was trying to tell them. They saw his drawings as art, not as warnings. The perspective is remarkable, said one of the local artists, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. And look at how he's captured the sense of movement in these falling beams. As the evening progressed, more and more people gathered around Tommy's wall. They discussed his use of shadow and light, the emotional intensity of the scenes, and the surprising sophistication of his technique. Some even suggested he might have a future in architectural illustration. Then a tall man in a gray suit approached the display. Unlike the other visitors who glanced and moved on, he stood completely still, studying each drawing with intense concentration. He moved from one sketch to another, occasionally leaning in to examine specific details. His expression grew increasingly serious as he took in the recurring patterns in Tommy's work, the stress points, the structural weaknesses, the precise locations of potential failure. The man pulled out a small notebook and began making notes, his eyes darting between the drawings and his paper. He seemed oblivious to the chattering crowd around him, focused entirely on Tommy's detailed renderings of the community hall's impending collapse. This was Martin Reed, though Tommy didn't know it yet. He stood before the wall of drawings for what seemed like ages, his furrowed brow and pursed lips suggesting deep thought rather than mere artistic appreciation. Tommy watched him from his hiding spot, struck by how differently this man studied his work. While others had seen art, this stranger seemed to be reading them like blueprints, understanding them in a way no one else had that evening. Martin Reed's fingers moved swiftly across his phone screen, documenting specific details from Tommy's drawings. His professional instincts, honed over 20 years of architectural work, told him these weren't mere artistic interpretations. The precision of the stress points and structural weak spots showed an understanding that went beyond casual observation. He spotted Ms. Clarkson nearby, discussing another student's watercolor with some parents. Waiting for a break in their conversation, he approached her with purpose. "Excuse me," Martin said, gesturing toward Tommy's wall. "I'm very interested in these architectural sketches. Could you tell me about the artist?" Ms. Clarkson's face lit up. "Those are Tommy Hawkins' work. He's one of my most talented students, only 10 years old, if you can believe it." Martin's eyebrows rose. 10? That's remarkable. The technical detail is extraordinary. Would it be possible to speak with him? "Of course." Ms. Clarkson scanned the room, spotting Tommy behind the potted plant. "Tommy, would you come here, please? There's someone who'd like to meet you." Tommy emerged slowly, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. Ms. Clarkson made the introductions, and Martin knelt down to Tommy's eye level. "These drawings are incredibly detailed, Tommy," Martin said, pointing to one of the sketches. "Can you tell me why you focused on these particular areas of the building?" Tommy glanced at Ms. Clarkson, then back at Martin. "Those are the weak spots," he said quietly. "Where it's going to break first." "Going to break?" Martin asked, his voice gentle and curious rather than dismissive. The words tumbled out of Tommy then, about the voice he'd heard in the hall, the vivid dreams that followed, and how nobody believed him. He described the specific creaks and groans he'd noticed, pointing to corresponding areas in his drawings. Martin listened intently, nodding as Tommy explained each detail. He asked specific questions about the location of support beams and the patterns of stress Tommy had depicted. Rather than doubt showing in his eyes, there was growing concern and professional interest. "Tommy," Martin said when the boy finished speaking, "I'm an architect who specializes in historical buildings. Would you mind if I took a look at the community hall myself?" Tommy's eyes widened. "You believe me?" "I believe these drawings show something worth investigating," Martin replied carefully. "Some of these structural details you've captured, they're things that typically only trained professionals would notice. I'd like to understand how you saw them and verify them for myself." For the first time in weeks, Tommy felt the heavy weight of responsibility lifting slightly from his shoulders. Here was someone who didn't dismiss his concerns or attribute them to grief. Someone who saw what he saw. Richard sat at his weathered desk in the Maplewood Gazette office, sifting through the morning mail, the familiar scent of coffee and newsprint hanging in the air. A plain manila envelope caught his eye. No return address, just his name typed neatly on the front in crisp black letters. He sliced it open with his trusty brass letter opener, the one he'd had since his first day on the job, and several folded papers slipped out onto his cluttered desk. As he began reading, his journalist's instincts kicked in, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. These were inspection reports for the community hall spanning the past 5 years, their pages yellowed and dog-eared with age. But something wasn't right. He noticed inconsistencies immediately, dates that didn't match up, signatures that looked different on duplicate forms, and entire sections that appeared to have been altered with suspicious precision. "What in the world?" he muttered, spreading the documents across his desk, the morning sunlight streaming through his office window illuminating the papers. Richard pulled up the public records database on his computer, the ancient machine humming to life. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he cross-referenced dates, names, and inspection details, the familiar rhythm of investigative work taking over. With each search, his frown deepened, creating new lines on his forehead. The official records showed regular inspections and passing grades, but these mysterious documents told a different, more troubling story. One report caught his particular attention. A structural assessment from 2 years ago that highlighted serious concerns about the support beams, with detailed notes about stress fractures and water damage. Yet the public record showed no such warnings. Instead, there was only a brief note about routine maintenance, barely a paragraph long. His heart began to race as he discovered more discrepancies, each one more alarming than the last. Budget reports showed allocated funds for repairs that were never completed, the money seemingly vanishing into thin air. Maintenance schedules had been modified, with critical work repeatedly postponed or marked as unnecessary in suspicious red ink. Richard's mind went to Tommy, to his son's desperate attempts to warn everyone about the hall. He thought of how they'd all dismissed Tommy's concerns, himself included, treating them as nothing more than the imaginings of an anxious child. The guilt sat heavy in his stomach like a stone. Pulling out his well-worn reporter's notebook, its pages filled with years of investigation notes, Richard began making calls. He contacted former maintenance workers, previous safety inspectors, and town officials who had served on past committees, his voice steady despite his growing concern. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a pattern of corner-cutting and cover-ups that stretched back further than he'd imagined. "I need to talk to you about some inspection reports," he said into his phone, scheduling meetings with sources who might shed more light on the situation, his pen poised above his notebook. "Off the record for now, this stays between us." Surrounded by spreading papers and sticky notes covered in his hurried handwriting, Richard leaned back in his squeaking chair. His son's warnings echoed in his mind, along with the dismissive responses Tommy had received from the entire town. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders. He picked up his pen with renewed determination, his jaw set firmly. This story needed to be told, not just for the safety of the town, but for Tommy, and for every person who'd ever been silenced when trying to speak the truth. Richard sat across from Dave Miller at the corner booth of Maplewood Diner, far from curious ears. Dave had worked in town administration for 20 years before retiring last spring, and his hands trembled slightly as he stirred his coffee. "It was Marcus Fletcher," Dave said quietly, sliding a folder across the table. "He's been the safety inspector for the past 8 years. Started taking shortcuts about 5 years ago when the budget got tight." Richard opened the folder, finding more documentation that matched the anonymous package he'd received. "And you're sure about this?" "Positive. I processed all the paperwork myself." Dave leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it goes deeper than Fletcher. Town officials knew about it. They chose to look the other way to avoid raising taxes for repairs." Back at his office, Richard received another visitor. Sarah Chen, a current clerk at Town Hall, had asked to meet privately. She nervously twisted her hands as she spoke. "I've been keeping copies of everything," she said, pulling out a USB drive. "Email exchanges, modified inspection reports, even photos of the actual damage they've been hiding. They don't know I have these." Richard spent the next several hours at his computer meticulously organizing the evidence. He created spreadsheets tracking the pattern of negligence, cross-referencing dates and names with both sets of documents. The story was becoming clear, a systematic effort to hide structural problems that should have been addressed years ago. As evening approached, Richard began writing his article. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard as he detailed the years of falsified reports and ignored warnings. He included quotes from his sources, carefully protected through anonymity, and laid out the timeline of deception. But halfway through, he paused. These weren't just names on a page, they were his neighbors, people he'd known for years. Marcus Fletcher's kids went to school with Tommy. The town officials played poker together every Thursday night. Richard rubbed his tired eyes. The article would shake the foundation of their community as surely as the compromised beams threatened the hall itself. Jobs would be lost. Friendships would end. The town's trust would be broken. Yet as he looked at Tommy's school photo on his desk, he remembered his son's desperate attempts to warn everyone. He thought of the families who gathered in that hall every week, unaware of the danger above their heads. Richard finished the article just before midnight. It was comprehensive, detailed, and damning. His cursor hovered over the send button as he reread the headline one last time. "Safety concerns ignored. Years of deception. Put Community Hall at risk." His hand trembled slightly as it rested on the mouse. With a deep breath, he clicked send. The next morning, Maplewood Main Street saw the newsstand owner Pete Harrison arranging the day's papers. The headline, "Safety concerns ignored. Years of deception. Put Community Hall at risk," blazed across the front page in bold letters. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered, their voices rising with each passing minute. "I can't believe Marcus would do this," Mrs. Peterson said, clutching her paper. "We trusted him with our children's safety." Across the street at Maplewood Diner, another group huddled over their coffee cups, their expressions dark with doubt. "It's just Richard trying to validate his boy's imagination," George Wilson grumbled. "Joe Baxter checked that building twice. Twice." Richard walked Tommy to school that morning, aware of the stares and whispers following them. Some neighbors waved supportively, while others turned away. Outside the school gates, Tommy's teacher, Ms. Clarkson, gave them both an encouraging smile. "You did the right thing," she said quietly to Richard. By noon, the town hall steps were packed with concerned citizens demanding answers. Mayor Thompson called an emergency public meeting for that evening. The community hall's main room buzzed with tension as people filed in, carefully eyeing the ceiling beams above. "The safety inspector, Marcus Fletcher, has been placed on administrative leave," Mayor Thompson announced, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "A state-level investigation will begin tomorrow." Shouts erupted from different corners of the room. "What about Joe's inspections?" someone called out. "How do we know this isn't just made up?" "There are photographs. Did you even read the article?" Richard stood at the back, notebook in hand, recording the chaos. He noticed Mrs. Linden making her way through the crowd toward Tommy, who sat alone near the window. "Some people need time to accept hard truths," she told Tommy gently, sitting beside him. "But you were brave to speak up, and your father was brave to listen." Later that afternoon, Tommy sat on a bench in the town square watching his neighbors argue and debate. Mr. Peterson walked past, giving Tommy a thumbs up, while Mrs. Wilson deliberately crossed the street to avoid him. The division in the town was as clear as the crack Tommy had drawn in his sketches of the hall's foundation. A group of his classmates played nearby, their parents shooting uncertain glances in his direction. Tommy felt the weight of their stares, not quite believing, not quite doubting, suspended in that uncomfortable space between truth and trust. Mrs. Linden's cozy living room filled with the aroma of fresh-baked cookies and coffee as neighbors began arriving for the informal gathering she'd organized. She had arranged chairs in a circle, creating an intimate atmosphere that encouraged open conversation. Tommy sat near the window, nervously fidgeting with a cookie as familiar faces filed in. "I know some of us have had different opinions about this situation," Mrs. Linden began, her voice warm and steady. "But we're here today because we all care about our community." To Tommy's surprise, even Mr. Wilson, who had been one of the vocal skeptics, took a seat across from him. The old man's face was softer than it had been during the town meeting. "I've been thinking," Mr. Wilson said, clearing his throat. "My granddaughter performs in that hall every Christmas. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss concerns about its safety." Others nodded in agreement. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the local bakery, spoke up next. "I remember when my mother warned everyone about the old bridge being unsafe 20 years ago. Nobody believed her either, until the spring floods nearly took it out." Tommy, encouraged by the supportive atmosphere, finally found his voice. "I know some people think I'm making things up," he said quietly. "But every time I go near the hall, I feel this worry in my stomach, like when you know something bad might happen." The room grew quiet as Tommy spoke, his words carrying the weight of weeks of burden and isolation. Mrs. Jenkins, the town librarian, reached over and patted his hand. "Sometimes the youngest eyes see things we've grown too comfortable to notice," she said thoughtfully. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation shifted from sharing concerns to taking action. Sarah Miller, a local attorney, pulled out a notepad and started drafting a petition for an independent inspection. "We need at least 200 signatures," she explained, "but I think we can get more. People are starting to realize this isn't just about one warning. It's about our whole community's safety." Others began organizing themselves into committees. One group would research independent inspection companies, another would review the town's building maintenance records, and a third would coordinate regular meetings to keep everyone informed. "We could meet here every Wednesday," Mrs. Linden offered. "Keep the momentum going until we get some real answers." Tommy watched in amazement as the adults around him transformed from skeptics into advocates. Even those who still had doubts about his warning agreed that a thorough inspection would benefit everyone. As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Linden stood in the center of the room. "Whether or not we find structural problems," she announced, looking directly at Tommy, You've already done something remarkable. You've reminded us that keeping our community safe requires courage, persistence, and working together." The group nodded in agreement, and Tommy felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with Mrs. Linden's cookies. The streets of Maplewood buzzed with excitement as townspeople hung colorful banners between lampposts and arranged pumpkins along the sidewalks. The annual Fall Festival was just days away, and everyone seemed caught up in the preparations. Everyone except Tommy. He walked slowly down Main Street, watching Mr. Peterson struggle with a particularly stubborn string of lights. The cheerful music playing from the coffee shop's speakers seemed to mock his growing unease. His stomach churned as he passed booth after booth being set up for the festival. "Tommy, come help me with these decorations," Richard called from where he was helping arrange hay bales near the community hall's entrance. Tommy dragged his feet as he approached his father. "Dad, are you sure we should have the festival here? Maybe we could move it to the park instead?" Tommy's voice was quiet but urgent. Richard paused his work, wiping his brow. "Son, we've been through this. The independent inspectors checked everything twice. The hall is perfectly safe." "But what if they missed something?" Tommy persisted. Mrs. Linden, who was nearby arranging fall flowers, set down her basket and walked over. "Tommy, dear, I know you're worried. But remember all the work we've done? All those inspections and reports?" Tommy nodded glumly, watching volunteers string twinkling lights across the hall's entrance. The building seemed to loom over them, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun like watchful eyes. Around them, the festival preparations continued in full swing. The craft vendors were marking their spots with chalk, and the food truck owners were checking their power requirements. Someone had set up speakers near the hall's entrance, testing the sound system with upbeat folk music. "Look how beautiful everything's going to be," Mrs. Linden said, gesturing to the decorations. But Tommy could only focus on the old timber beams visible through the hall's windows, imagining creaks and groans that weren't there. The festival committee bustled past, clipboards in hand, discussing last-minute details about the cake contest placement and the children's face painting station. Their excited chatter about expected record attendance only made Tommy's anxiety worse. He stood at the edge of the festival grounds, watching as the final touches transformed the community hall into a festive centerpiece. Orange and yellow lights twinkled along its eaves, and hand-painted banners proclaimed, "Welcome to Maplewood's 75th Annual Fall Festival," across its entrance. But to Tommy, each decoration felt like another weight added to the building's tired shoulders. He wrapped his arms around himself, unable to shake the feeling that they were decorating a disaster waiting to happen. The time of autumn had come when Maplewood's Main Street saw the Fall Festival parade begin. Colorful floats rolled past storefronts, their decorations glinting in the morning light. The high school marching band filled the air with cheerful music, while children in Halloween costumes skipped alongside, waving to the crowd. Tommy stood with his father near Miller's Bakery, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. While others swayed to the music and cheered, his eyes kept darting toward the community hall looming at the end of the street. "Look, Tommy, there's your class float." Richard pointed excitedly at the approaching farm-themed display, where Tommy's classmates rode on hay bales, dressed as vegetables and farmers. Tommy managed a weak smile, but his attention quickly returned to the hall's timber frame. Each bass drum from the marching band made him flinch, imagining it was the sound of cracking wood. As the parade wound down, the festival activities began in earnest. The smell of cotton candy and grilled corn filled the air. Children ran between game booths, clutching stuffed animals and candy apples. Richard guided Tommy through the festivities, trying to engage him in the fun. "Want to try the ring toss? You've always been good at that," Richard suggested, steering them toward a booth decorated with blinking lights. Tommy shrugged, his eyes fixed on a group of people entering the hall for the craft fair. "Dad, maybe we should tell people not to go inside." Richard squeezed his son's shoulder. "Everything's fine, Tommy. Look how much fun everyone's having." All around them, the festival was in full swing. Face-painted children chased each other through the crowd. The local theater group performed scenes from their upcoming play on a small stage. Elderly couples sat on benches, tapping their feet to folk music. But Tommy remained disconnected from the joy surrounding him. Each laugh seemed hollow, each smile a mask hiding potential danger. He watched as more people streamed into the hall for various activities. the baking contest judging, art displays, and local history exhibits. As evening approached, strings of lights twinkled to life across the festival grounds. A popular local band set up their equipment near the hall's entrance, drawing a growing crowd. The music started, upbeat and loud, and people began to dance. Tommy stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart racing with each vibration from the speakers. The hall's windows reflected the colorful stage lights, making the building seem alive and ominous in the growing darkness. While families and friends swayed to the music, Tommy remained still, a solitary figure amid the celebration, unable to shake the weight of his fears. The local band, the Maple Tones, filled the evening air with their signature blend of folk rock, the familiar tunes echoing across the fairgrounds. Their lead singer's voice carried across the festival grounds as couples twirled and children hopped to the beat, their laughter mixing with the music. Strings of lights swayed gently in the autumn breeze, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the happy crowd, while fallen leaves skittered across the ground. Tommy stood at the edge of the gathering, his back pressed against a massive maple tree, its rough bark digging into his shirt. His eyes remained fixed on the community hall's entrance, where people continued to flow in and out, carrying plates of steaming pie and proudly displaying their craft projects. The scent of cinnamon and apple drifted through the air, but Tommy barely noticed. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled, sending ripples through cups of cider and causing lawn chairs to shift. The music screeched to a halt as microphone stands wobbled and decorations swayed dangerously. The tremor lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make the festival lights flicker ominously and the crowd fall silent, their cheerful conversations dying mid-sentence. "Everyone get away from the hall!" Tommy's voice cut through the quiet, high and desperate. He rushed forward, waving his arms frantically. "Please, you have to listen. The building isn't safe." People turned to stare as Tommy ran between groups, trying to shepherd them away from the building, his sneakers pounding against the grass. "Please move back. It's going to collapse." The initial shock of the tremor quickly gave way to nervous laughter among the crowd, spreading like a wave through the gathering. Someone called out, "Hey, nice special effects!" Others joined in, clapping as if it had been part of the show, their relief palpable in the cool evening air. "Tommy!" Richard hurried to his son's side, gently taking his arm while shooting apologetic glances at nearby onlookers. "It's okay, buddy. It was just a small shake. Everything's fine." "No, Dad, you don't understand." Tommy tried to pull away, his voice cracking with emotion and urgency. "This is what I've been warning everyone about. The dreams, the voices, they were right." Mrs. Linden appeared beside them, her face creased with concern as she adjusted her woolen shawl. "Tommy, dear, take a deep breath. The building's still standing strong, just like it has for all these years." Around them, the festival resumed its rhythm with determined cheerfulness. The band started up again, this time with a popular dance tune that drew people back to their celebrations, their feet tapping against the grass. Someone nearby muttered, "Poor kid's really losing it," while another responded, "Can't blame him after losing his mom. Such a shame." Tommy stood frozen, watching helplessly as people returned to the hall, some giving him pitying looks as they passed by with their paper plates and plastic cups. His cheeks burned with embarrassment, and his hands trembled at his sides, fingers curling into tight fists. The weight of their dismissal pressed down on him like a physical force as the festivities continued around him, his urgent warnings already forgotten in the resuming revelry. The autumn wind picked up, causing the festival lights to sway more vigorously, casting shifting shadows that seemed to mock his fears. The festival's cheerful energy had begun to fade as volunteers stacked chairs and collected trash under darkening skies. The sweet scent of cotton candy and popcorn gave way to the sharp smell of approaching rain. Wind gusters scattered paper cups and napkins across the town square. Tommy sat alone on a wooden bench near the park, his shoulders slumped. He watched workers hurrying to pack up their booths and tables before the storm hit. The community hall still bustled with activity as people helped move equipment and decorations inside, seeking shelter from the weather. Dark clouds rolled in fast, turning the evening sky an ominous gray-green. The wind picked up, whipping fallen leaves into small tornadoes and rattling the festival banners that hadn't yet been taken down. The first fat raindrops splattered against the pavement, quickly turning into a heavy downpour. A deep, terrible crack split the air like thunder, but it wasn't thunder at all. The sound came from the direction of the community hall, followed by the grinding screech of twisting metal and splintering wood. "Get out!" someone screamed from inside. "Everyone out now!" Before Tommy's horrified eyes, a section of the hall's roof caved inward. Part of the wall buckled and crumbled, sending bricks and debris tumbling down. People streamed out of the building in panic, some helping others who had been struck by falling materials. Tommy jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. Instead of freezing or running away, he rushed toward the chaos. "This way!" he shouted, waving people toward the park. "Get away from the building!" He spotted an elderly woman stumbling on the wet ground and ran to help her up. "Ma'am, lean on me," he said, supporting her weight as he guided her to safety. Rain poured down his face as he returned to help others, directing them away from the unstable structure. Sirens wailed in the distance as emergency vehicles approached. Tommy continued moving through the crowd, checking on people, helping those who needed assistance to reach the medical teams that were arriving. His clothes were soaked through, but he barely noticed. The storm raged on, lightning flashing across the sky as Tommy watched ambulances and fire trucks pull up to the scene. His prediction had come true, the very thing he had dreaded and warned about for so long. But there was no satisfaction in being right, only a sick feeling in his stomach as he saw neighbors and friends being treated for injuries. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery had a cut on her forehead. Mr. Garcia from the hardware store was holding his arm funny. Tommy felt tears mixing with the rain on his face, knowing that if people had only listened earlier, this might have been prevented. He stood in the downpour watching emergency responders work, feeling the heavy weight of vindication mixed with deep worry for his community. The collapse he had foreseen had finally happened, but instead of relief at being proven right, all Tommy felt was concern for the people around him and a desperate hope that everyone would be okay. The first rays of sunlight crept over Maplewood, casting long shadows across the wreckage of the community hall. The morning air was crisp and clean after the storm, but the scene before the townspeople was devastating. Chunks of brick and twisted metal lay scattered across the muddy ground, and yellow caution tape fluttered in the gentle morning breeze. Emergency crews had worked through the night, and now in the clear light of day, the full extent of the damage became apparent. The hall's eastern wall had completely collapsed, leaving a gaping hole that exposed the building's wooden skeleton. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles still surrounded the area, their lights now dim in the growing daylight. Tommy walked beside his father through the debris-strewn street, his sneakers squishing in the wet earth. Richard kept a protective hand on his son's shoulder as they surveyed the damage together. The sight made Tommy's stomach clench. It was exactly as he had seen in his dreams, down to the way the roof had caved in at its weakest point. "If it hadn't been for Tommy's warnings, we would have had the whole town in there for the festival finale," Mrs. Linden said to a group of neighbors. Her words carried across the morning air, causing heads to turn toward Tommy. "That boy knew," Mr. Peterson added, his arm in a sling. "He tried to tell us all, and we wouldn't listen." Small groups of residents gathered around the perimeter, sharing their experiences from the previous night. "I remember Tommy trying to warn us about the tremor," said Sarah from the flower shop. "We all laughed it off, but he knew." As Tommy and his father passed by, people reached out to pat Tommy's shoulder or squeeze his hand. The same townspeople who had dismissed his concerns now looked at him with newfound respect and gratitude. Some even apologized directly for doubting him. "You saved lives yesterday, son," Chief Roberts said as he approached Tommy. The fire chief's uniform was still dirty from the night's work. "Your warnings got people thinking about safety. If we'd had the finale concert in there as planned," he shook his head, leaving the sentence unfinished. Emergency crews continued their work, documenting damage and securing loose structures. Engineers in hard hats took measurements and photos, discussing repair possibilities in hushed tones. Through it all, Tommy stood quietly watching, accepting the grateful nods and kind words from passing neighbors with humble acknowledgement. Mrs. Linden approached Tommy with tears in her eyes. "I should have pushed harder for another inspection when you first came to me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were right all along." The morning sun climbed higher as the cleanup effort continued. Tommy remained at the scene, watching as volunteers began clearing smaller debris, his presence a reminder to everyone of the importance of listening to even the most unlikely warnings. The community's respect showed in their eyes and gestures, in the way they now included him in their discussions about the hall's future. The emergency town meeting was held in the school gymnasium, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a makeshift stage. Nearly every resident of Maplewood had turned out, their faces showing a mix of concern and anger as they settled into their seats. Tommy sat with his father in the third row, watching as Mayor Thompson stepped up to the podium. "We're here to discuss the devastating collapse of our beloved community hall," the mayor began, his voice echoing through the gymnasium, "and to understand how this could have happened despite recent safety inspections." The crowd murmured, and from somewhere in the middle section, a woman stood up. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, wearing a navy blazer and clutching a thick manila envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised them. I have something to say," she announced, her voice shaky but determined. "My name is Sarah Jennings. I was Assistant Engineer Joe Baxter's administrative assistant." The room fell silent as Sarah made her way to the front. Tommy watched her carefully, noting how she gripped the envelope tighter as she walked. "For the past year, I've been witness to something terrible," Sarah continued, opening the envelope. "Mr. Baxter was paid by Winchester Construction to overlook serious structural issues in the community hall during their renovation work last spring." Gasps and angry mutters rippled through the crowd. Sarah pulled out several documents, laying them on the podium. "These are emails between Mr. Baxter and James Winchester, discussing payments in exchange for approved inspections. There are also falsified inspection reports where serious structural problems were deliberately omitted." Mayor Thompson picked up the documents, his face growing darker as he scanned them. "These appear to be authentic municipal documents," he confirmed gravely. "I wanted to come forward sooner," Sarah's voice cracked slightly, "but I was afraid of losing my job. I'm the one who sent the anonymous package to Mr. Hawkins at the newspaper." The gymnasium erupted with angry voices. "We could have lost lives," someone shouted. "Our children could have been in there," called another. Tommy watched as Sarah stood straighter, gaining confidence from the supportive nods around her. "I have copies of bank statements showing the payments and text messages discussing which problems to ignore," she continued. "They knew about the weak foundation and the compromised support beams. They knew it wasn't safe." Mrs. Linden stood up from her seat. "Thank you for your courage, Sarah," she said firmly. "It couldn't have been easy to keep this secret." Others joined in with words of support, though many still expressed their outrage at the corruption. Tommy caught Sarah's eye and gave her an encouraging nod. He understood what it felt like to know something important and struggled to make others listen. "Rest assured," Mayor Thompson's voice cut through the chaos, "we will be launching a full investigation. The proper authorities have already been notified." Sarah returned to her seat, visibly relieved as supportive hands patted her shoulders. The town's determination to seek justice was palpable in the room, with various council members already discussing next steps and legal actions. Tommy watched as Sarah sat down, her shoulders relaxing for what seemed like the first time since she stood up. She had done what he had tried to do, warn everyone about the danger, but with proof that no one could ignore. The truth was finally out. The courthouse steps were crowded with Maplewood residents on the crisp autumn morning of the hearing. Tommy stood close to his father, watching as Joe Baxter and James Winchester were led into the building by their lawyers. The engineer's once confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by nervous glances at the crowd. Inside the packed courtroom, Tommy sat between his father and Mrs. Linden. Sarah Jennings was already seated near the front, her testimony folder placed neatly on her lap. The prosecution began by presenting the email exchanges and bank statements that Sarah had preserved. "These documents show a clear pattern of bribery and willful negligence," the prosecutor stated, displaying the evidence on a large screen. "Mr. Baxter received payments totaling $50,000 to overlook critical structural issues." Richard Hawkins was called to testify next. He spoke clearly about his investigation, presenting additional evidence he'd gathered from other sources. Multiple contractors had raised concerns about the hall's foundation during the renovation, he explained. These concerns were systematically ignored. Television cameras from several stations recorded the proceedings, while reporters scribbled notes furiously. The story had grown beyond Maplewood's borders, with headlines about small-town corruption and near tragedy appearing in state newspapers. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver hair, listened intently as Sarah Jennings took the stand. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she detailed the months of watching the corruption unfold. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "we request a thorough audit of all projects overseen by both defendants in the past 5 years. We have reason to believe this wasn't an isolated incident." The judge nodded gravely. "I'm ordering a complete investigation into all construction projects handled by Mr. Baxter and Winchester Construction since 2018, she declared. "The safety of our communities cannot be compromised for profit." During a brief recess, town council members gathered in the courthouse hallway, discussing changes to local building codes. "We need independent oversight," Councilwoman Peters insisted. "Multiple inspectors, regular reviews, no more single points of failure." Mayor Thompson agreed, already drafting notes for new regulations. "We'll implement a citizen oversight committee," he announced. "Transparency at every step of future projects." Outside the courthouse, as the first day of hearings concluded, clusters of townspeople gathered on the lawn. Tommy overheard snippets of conversation about trust, responsibility, and the need for change. "We got lucky," Mrs. Linden said to a group nearby. "If it hadn't been for Tommy's warnings and Sarah's courage, this could have ended much worse." A local contractor spoke up from the crowd. "We need to look out for each other better," he said. "Can't just assume everything's being done right anymore." The autumn wind rustled through the trees as the community continued their discussions, their anger at the betrayal mixing with determination to prevent future corruption. The morning of the groundbreaking ceremony dawned bright and clear. Tommy stood near the podium at the construction site, fidgeting with his tie while Mayor Thompson addressed the gathered crowd. "Today marks a new chapter for Maplewood," the mayor announced, "and it's fitting that young Tommy Hawkins, whose courage and persistence helped prevent a tragedy, will lay the first stone of our new community hall." Martin Reed, the architect who had first noticed Tommy's drawings, stepped forward with blueprints rolled under his arm. He spread them across a table for everyone to see. "We've incorporated state-of-the-art safety features," Martin explained, pointing to various sections. "The foundation will be reinforced with additional support structures, and we've added emergency exits on all sides." Tommy listened intently as Martin detailed the safety measures. His eyes lit up when the architect mentioned the transparent observation windows that would allow everyone to monitor the construction progress. "Tommy's been an invaluable part of our planning meetings," Martin added, smiling at the boy. "His suggestions about natural lighting and community spaces have really shaped our design." The construction workers wearing their bright yellow hard hats gathered around Tommy. Mike, the foreman, handed him a small hard hat of his own with Junior Site Inspector written on it. "You're always welcome here, kid," Mike said warmly. "We could use those sharp eyes of yours." Sarah Collins, the town treasurer, stepped up to discuss the community fund. "We've established a transparent accounting system," she explained. "Weekly reports will be posted online, and anyone can attend our budget meetings." Tommy approached the designated spot where the first stone would be placed. The smooth granite block gleamed in the sunlight, and engraved on its surface were the words, "Built with truth, standing with pride, Maplewood Community Hall, 2024. Mrs. Linden squeezed his shoulder gently as he bent down to place the stone. The crowd fell silent, cameras clicking as Tommy carefully positioned the block. As he stepped back, applause erupted from the gathered community members. "This stone represents more than just a new building," Mayor Thompson said. "It represents our commitment to honesty, transparency, and listening to every voice in our community, no matter how young they might be." The construction workers lined up to shake Tommy's hand, each one promising to keep him updated on their progress. Martin showed him where his own small desk would be in the site office, complete with a set of safety gear for his visits. The community watched with pride as Tommy examined the construction site with newfound confidence. No longer the isolated boy who struggled to make his voice heard, but a respected member of their town who had helped forge a stronger, more honest community. Tommy sat on a stack of lumber near the construction site, his legs swinging back and forth as he watched the workers pour concrete for the foundation. His junior site inspector hard hat gleamed in the sunlight, and he took notes in a small notebook about the day's activities. The rhythmic sound of hammering and the steady hum of machinery filled the air. Tommy enjoyed these peaceful moments, feeling accepted and valued by the construction crew who always greeted him with friendly waves and took time to explain their work. Suddenly, the familiar voice that had warned him about the old community hall rang clear in his mind. Danger lies beneath. The ground is not stable here. The voice was calm but urgent, making Tommy's heart race. He jumped up from his perch, dropping his notebook. The voice continued, more specific this time. Check the ground near the southeast corner. What lies below could compromise everything. Tommy ran toward Mike, the site foreman, who was reviewing blueprints with two other workers. "Mike!" he called out, slightly out of breath. "I need to tell you something important." Mike turned, concern crossing his face at Tommy's urgent tone. "What's wrong, buddy?" "I heard the voice again," Tommy said, pointing toward the southeast corner of the construction site. "It's warning about something dangerous under the ground there. We need to check it out." The workers nearby stopped what they were doing, remembering how Tommy's previous warning had proved true. Mike studied Tommy's face carefully, then nodded. "All right, let's take a look. Better safe than sorry." Mike grabbed his radio and called for the ground assessment team. Within minutes, work had halted in that section of the site, and the crew was setting up ground-penetrating radar equipment. "We'll do a complete scan of the area you indicated," the technician explained to Tommy, who watched intently as they calibrated the equipment. "This machine can show us if there's anything unusual underground." The construction crew gathered around, some crossing their arms, others leaning on their tools as they waited. Tommy stood next to Mike, fidgeting with the straps of his hard hat as the technicians began their careful sweep of the area. The radar machine hummed softly as it was pushed across the ground in careful, methodical lines. Tommy's eyes never left the screen, though he couldn't understand the complex readings it displayed. The technicians spoke in low voices, pointing at various spots on the monitor. Time seemed to slow as the assessment continued. Tommy's hands were clasped tightly together, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The memory of the old community hall's collapse was still fresh in his mind, and he prayed this time people would take his warning seriously enough to prevent another disaster. The construction crew maintained a respectful silence, their usual banter absent as they waited for the results. Some of them placed reassuring hands on Tommy's shoulders as they stood together, united in their trust of the young boy who had already proved himself once before. The ground-penetrating radar's screen suddenly lit up with an unusual pattern, causing the technicians to exchange worried glances. After several more passes over the area, they confirmed their findings to Mike and the crew. "There's definitely something down there," the lead technician announced, pointing to the radar image. "It looks like an old well structure, and there's unusual density readings around it." Within hours, an excavation team carefully dug around the spot Tommy had indicated. As they worked deeper, the acrid smell of chemicals filled the air. The crew immediately backed away, and Mike called for environmental specialists. The specialists arrived in white protective suits carrying testing equipment. After a thorough examination, they confirmed everyone's fears. They had uncovered an old well that had been used as an illegal dump site for hazardous materials decades ago. "If we hadn't found this now, these chemicals could have leaked into the new foundation," one specialist explained to the gathered crowd. "The concrete would have cracked over time, compromising the entire structure." Yellow caution tape went up around the perimeter as cleanup crews in protective gear began their careful work. News spread quickly through Maplewood, and soon town council members arrived to assess the situation. "This is deeply concerning," Council President Martha Stevens announced to the gathered crowd. "We need to investigate how many other undocumented wells or dump sites might exist in our town." The council quickly organized an emergency meeting, drawing up plans for a comprehensive safety audit of all public buildings and abandoned properties in Maplewood. They created task forces to review historical records and interview older residents about possible forgotten hazards. Tommy watched the cleanup operation from a safe distance, his expression serious. Mrs. Linden stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You've done it again, Tommy," she said softly. "You've protected all of us." The environmental team worked methodically, carefully removing barrel after barrel of hazardous waste from the old well. Their movements were precise and calculated, ensuring nothing spilled or leaked during the extraction process. Town residents gathered at the edges of the safety perimeter, watching the operation with a mixture of concern and gratitude. Many approached Tommy to thank him, acknowledging that his warning had prevented what could have been another disaster. The construction foreman updated his plans, marking the area for special reinforcement once the cleanup was complete. "We'll need to adjust our timeline," he explained to the town council members. "But better safe than sorry." Tommy stood quietly observing the scene, his junior hard hat still firmly in place. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but this time it was accompanied by something else, the comfort of knowing his community now trusted and supported him. The cleanup would take time, but they had caught the problem before any harm was done, and that made all the difference. The town hall buzzed with anticipation as Tommy approached the podium. His father gave him an encouraging nod from the front row, and Mrs. Linden smiled warmly from her seat beside him. The wooden steps creaked under Tommy's feet as he climbed to stand behind the microphone, which had been lowered to accommodate his height. "I used to think being different was bad," Tommy began, his voice quiet but steady. "When I first heard the warnings about the community hall, I was scared to tell anyone. But now I know that sometimes being different means you can help people in ways others can't." The room fell silent as Tommy shared his story, from the first warning about the hall to the discovery of the hazardous well. His words, simple and honest, touched everyone present. "We need to work together to keep our town safe," he continued, gaining confidence. "Every person, no matter how young or old, can help. Sometimes the most important thing is just speaking up when something doesn't feel right." Council President Stevens stood up after Tommy's speech. "In light of recent events, we'd like to invite Tommy to serve as our first youth representative on the new Safety Oversight Committee. His unique perspective will be invaluable." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. People began raising their hands, volunteering for various safety initiatives. Some offered to help with building inspections, while others suggested starting educational programs in schools. "We could teach kids about environmental safety," suggested a local teacher. "Help them understand why proper disposal of materials is so important." Tommy watched in amazement as his community came together, inspired by his words. The meeting evolved into a planning session, with residents organizing themselves into different committees. They looked to Tommy for input, valuing his opinions and ideas. Later that afternoon, Tommy visited his mother's grave. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. He sat on the grass beside the headstone, running his fingers over the engraved letters of her name. "I think it was you all along, Mom," he whispered, feeling a deep sense of peace. "Your voice helping me protect everyone." The wind seemed to wrap around him like a gentle embrace, and Tommy felt closer to her than he had in months. He understood now that her guidance hadn't left him. It had just taken a different form, leading him to become someone who could make a real difference in his community. The new community hall stood proudly in the heart of Maplewood, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning sun. Colorful banners declaring, "Festival of Truth and Resilience," fluttered in the autumn breeze, while strings of lights crisscrossed overhead, ready to illuminate the evening celebrations. Inside, the hall buzzed with activity as volunteers put finishing touches on display boards, showcasing the town's journey over the past year. The polished wooden floors and reinforced beams represented not just a new building, but a renewed commitment to community values. Mayor Wilson stepped up to the podium, her voice carrying across the packed hall. "Today, we celebrate more than just a new building. We celebrate the spirit that brought us here. A spirit embodied by a young boy who refused to stay silent when he knew something was wrong." Tommy sat between his father and Mrs. Linden, his cheeks flushing as the mayor continued to praise his courage. Throughout the day, Residents participated in workshops on community safety and environmental awareness. At the safety demonstration booth, children learned about proper building maintenance and the importance of reporting concerns. In one corner, a memorial display showed photographs of the old hall, newspaper clippings about its collapse and the subsequent investigation. People gathered there speaking in hushed tones about lessons learned and changes made. The afternoon's highlight came when Tommy was called to the stage. Mayor Wilson held up a gleaming plaque, the Maplewood Community Service Award. "For extraordinary courage and dedication to community safety," she read, her voice filled with emotion. "Tommy Hawkins showed us that truth and persistence, even from our youngest citizens, can save lives." Tommy accepted the award with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the standing ovation that followed. His father wiped away tears, while Mrs. Linden beamed with pride. As dusk approached, the community gathered outside. Each person held a paper lantern, its soft glow creating a warm circle of light. Tommy stood with his father, Mrs. Linden, and his closest supporters. The mayor raised her lantern first, and others followed suit. "These lanterns represent our promise," she announced. "A promise to remain vigilant, to speak up, and to stand together." One by one, the lanterns rose into the darkening sky, creating a river of light that drifted upward. Tommy watched them float away, each one carrying the hopes and commitments of his community. The gentle warmth of belonging wrapped around him as he stood surrounded by his neighbors, his family, and his friends. No longer the outsider, but a respected young leader in his beloved town. If you enjoyed the story of Tommy, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.